Number 3. My dad has been an MTA transit subway station manager for 35 years. In his job, there always has to be a manager on duty, so he's worked every possible shift, including countless night shifts. Most of the time, the trains were completely empty during the night, which he found to be the only nice part of those shifts. Over the years, he's collected a series of funny and weird night shift stories, but there's one that stands out as downright horrifying. One night, my dad boarded a train to move to his office at another station. It was around 3 a.m., and he was alone when he got on. At the next station, someone else boarded a tall, skinny man with pale skin, wearing a heavy jacket and a beanie. The man glanced at my dad briefly before sitting in the farthest corner of the train car, away from him. My dad immediately felt uncomfortable as the man kept looking up at him every so often. When my dad's stop came, both he and the other man got off the train. My dad walked to his office, unlocked the door, and glanced behind him. The man in the jacket was pacing around, about 50 feet away. My dad stepped into his office, locked the door, and sat at his desk. 5 minutes later, someone tried to turn the doorknob. When they realized it was locked, they started knocking softly. My dad called out, "Who is it?" The response was, "I want to talk." Sensing trouble, my dad told whoever it was to go away. He was sure it was the guy from the train, as this station was usually deserted at that hour. The knocking continued for about 5 minutes before my dad decided to check the security cameras. Sure enough, it was the guy from the train, still wearing the jacket and beanie. Coincidentally, as soon as my dad brought up the camera feed, the man walked away. My dad went about his work for about half an hour before leaving to catch the next train. He checked the cameras again to make sure the strange man wasn't around, then locked up and headed down to the platform. As soon as he boarded the train, he looked out the window and saw the same man from before, walking down the stairs to the platform and stepping into the same car. The man sat down on the opposite side, a few seats to the right, and stared at my dad for the entire ride to the next station. My dad, trying to avoid confrontation, looked away and pretended not to notice him, but he eventually gave in and stared back, offering a slight nod and smile as a sort of truce. The man continued to stare until the train reached the next station. My dad didn't dare look back at him after that first time. Now, you might be wondering why my dad didn't try to get the guy to back off. Despite his intimidating size, my dad has always been a gentle giant, no bark and no bite. He also feared the man might be armed, and one wrong move could be deadly. When the train finally stopped, my dad practically ran back up to the street, constantly glancing over his shoulder. And yes, the man from the train was following him. My dad found the first open public building he could thankfully. It was a Wendy's. He stepped inside and watched as the man who had been following him walked up to the window, stopped, and stared at him through the glass for about 10 seconds before turning around and walking across the street. My dad waited a little longer before leaving Wendy's to get to his third and final station for the night. The scariest part came when my dad was in his third office, checking the security cameras out of paranoia. He saw the same man from the train pacing around outside, only about 30 feet from his office. The man then stopped, looked up at the camera, and according to my dad, literally froze and stared at it for no less than a minute. When he finally lowered his head, he walked away and left the station, never to be seen by my dad again. To this day, my dad doesn't know if he was followed after leaving Wendy's, but it would make sense. The man was clearly disturbed, possibly homeless, and likely dangerous. Who knows what his true intentions were? Number 2. My friends and I were in New York around Christmas time. We didn't decide to leave until about 2 a.m., so we caught the first train we could find. As expected, it was empty, and by then, we were mostly sober. But then we heard a sudden commotion in the next car over. We peeked through the glass between the cars and saw 2 hooded men, possibly teenagers, standing uncomfortably close to a woman sitting in one of the seats who was screaming for help. I suggested we go over and confront them, but as my buddy and I got closer, we noticed they were armed with handguns. I quickly urged all my friends to move to the next car, away from the armed men. As we moved, I glanced back and saw one of the men pointing at us before starting to follow. We ran through at least 3 different cars, with the men in pursuit. Before the train finally stopped at the next station, we all sprinted through the old station, looking for a place to hide. I got separated from my friends and ended up hiding behind a garbage can. I could hear the sound of my pursuers' shoes hitting the tiled floors, so I knew I had no time to find a better hiding spot. I peeked through the opening at the top of the bin and got a better look at them. One was black, the other appeared to be Indian, and they both looked very young. I initially thought they just wanted to rob us, but then I heard one of them say, "If you find them, kill them." I nearly gave away my position in shock, almost knocking the garbage bin over. Miraculously, they didn't catch me. They left the area, and I noticed they didn't have their guns drawn at that moment. I ran in the opposite direction and quickly found my friends, who were waving me over from behind a large pillar. We took cover behind another pillar, not far from the first one, and waited as long as we thought necessary. The biggest shock came when we saw the woman from the train, who we thought was being threatened, walking towards the 2 men and calling out something like, "Where are they? Don't tell me you didn't get them." The 2 men reappeared from around a corner and walked over to the woman. The rest of what they said was too low to hear, but they eventually walked back down the stairs to the platforms. We could only assume they were waiting for another train to try their trap again. At the very least, we called the police and reported what had happened, but I have no idea if they were ever caught. Number 1. My name is Danny. I'm 22 years old, and this was the most horrifying experience of my life. I live and work in New York City, and since I don't have a car, my main mode of transportation is the subway. It was a Saturday night, and I was on my way home from a party in the middle of the night. I did this almost every other weekend, so I was completely fine with taking the subway alone at night. As I walked down the steps and entered the underground, there wasn't a soul in sight, which was always a bit eerie. This particular station was very tightly spaced, and as I walked, I felt like I was being watched or followed. Occasionally, I heard echoing bangs from an unknown location. I was early for the train, so I sat on a bench and waited. "This is something straight out of a horror movie," I heard a voice say. "Over here, buddy." There was someone standing on the tracks inside the tunnel, poking his head out and looking at me. It was a filthy-looking man, probably in his early 40s, with a horrible yellow smile, missing at least 3 teeth. I could tell even from where I was sitting. I tried to ignore him, but he wouldn't go away. Then I heard laughing coming from inside the tunnel, and another disgusting-looking man stuck his face out as well. He gave me a nasty smile before telling me to come hang out with them in the tunnel. The way they stared at me, their eyes wouldn't even move, like they were locked onto me. I continued to ignore them and just waited for the train. In my peripheral vision, I noticed one of the men moving away into the tunnel, returning moments later with something else, another face. I had to look again. There was a third face, but this one was hunched over and lifeless. It looked like one of the men was holding the guy's head up. The sound of the train approaching was a huge relief. I got up, ready to board, but when I got closer to the edge of the platform, I nearly threw up at the sight. The 2 men were retreating into the tunnel, and the second man was holding something in his hand ahead. Just ahead, like a decapitated head. They disappeared from sight as the train arrived. I got into the first car, planning to warn the conductor, but no later than after we left the station. I didn't want to be there a second longer. As the train started moving, I saw legs descending the stairs to the platform, but that was it. I didn't get to see who it was. But what I did see as the train moved into the tunnel was a group of men huddled up against the railing, inches away from the train window, all staring right at me. I pounded on the conductor's door like a madman, screaming that it was an emergency. He opened the door, and I explained what I had just seen. He radioed someone in charge of the station and another higher up in the company, who I'm sure took care of it or contacted the proper authorities or security, whatever. It felt like ages before my stop finally came, but when it did, I practically ran out of the station, feeling like a huge weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I've since been to one more party at the same friend's house, but I skipped that station. I decided it was worth the extra long walk to the next station. I don't know if weird stuff happens often in the subway at night. Before this incident, I never experienced anything like it. But after that night, I learned one thing. You should always be extremely cautious in an isolated place like a subway station late at night.